Welcome to the webinar, Bobwhite Quail, Bringing Back an Iconic Maryland Bird. Bobwhite quail populations have declined by over 90% in the Mid-Atlantic region in the last half century. In this Making a Home for Birds webinar hosted by Audubon Society of Central Maryland, Bob Long of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources will discuss the biology and habitat requirements of quail, the factors that cause their decline, and what landowners and other individuals can do to help reverse the trend. Bob is the wild turkey and upland game bird biologist for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. He received a bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech and a master's degree from West Virginia University, both in wildlife management. He has worked for DNR for 20 years and focuses his efforts on monitoring populations and establishing habitat for bobwhite quail, wild turkeys, and ruffed grouse. He resides in Hurlock, Maryland, and spends his free time enjoying many outdoor activities. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob.
Great, thanks, Angela. So I will share my screen here. I appreciate that introduction, and great to see so many attendees here. It's like well over 50, so that's great. Thanks for the opportunity to present some information about quail this evening. Hopefully you pick up a few things that you might not have heard before, and let me see here. So hopefully you can see my screen at this point. Just let me know if you can't, but I believe you should be able to. It looks a little bit different than what I'm used to, but we'll go with this. I can't see the chat, so we'll have to wait to the end for that. But yeah, like Angela said, so the title of my slide presentation here isn't quite as catchy. I kind of like the bringing back an iconic Maryland bird better, though. That was a good title. You know, I've been in this position for about 20 years now, so I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of landowners, farmers, birders, hunters, you know, just a lot of folks that are very passionate about quail, and there's a real connection to this species that I don't think exists with a lot of other bird species or wildlife species in Maryland. And you know, we had at one time densities of quail that were higher than anywhere in the country. You know, 50 years ago in Maryland, which is really surprising. If you weren't around during that time, you wouldn't realize that we had so many quail back then. But you know, unfortunately, they've declined. But you know, you still have folks that remember the good old days, so to speak, and they would love to get back to that. And I'm not sure if that's feasible at this point, but I do think that we can stabilize the population declines that we've been seeing, and restore them in places so that this bird remains a part of our suite of wildlife species and is out there for interested folks to go out and enjoy, and for birders to go hear the whistle of the bobwhite. Is I think something that's surely worth trying to protect. So let's jump into the presentation. Let's go over a few general characteristics of quail. And I call them quail or bobwhite quail. That's what everybody knows these birds as, but their name is northern bobwhite. And you can see the two species here on the bottom. The males are slightly more brightly colored, like a lot of bird species, and they have this very white streak and throat patch compared to the female, which is more of a buffy color. And the call, I think, and I'm not sure if this will work on Zoom, but I will try to play the call of the male, which you should be familiar with. where they get their bobwhite name. So that's the call of the male that you're listening for in the summer. Lesser known call is the call of the female. Males will actually do this call as well. And there's really a variety of calls, and kind of oversimplifying it here. But the call of the female, and like I said, at times males will do this as well, but it's what we call a covey call or an assembly call. So hopefully you could hear that. And we actually do surveys during the fall on areas where we have quail. And we listen for that call, and they do that call just at daylight, right when just barely breaking daylight. You start to hear the first birds calling. Oftentimes these quail coveys will communicate back and forth with that call, that assembly call or covey call. And this is a small gallinaceous bird, a resident bird. They don't migrate. And I used to say that preferred grassland or shrubland habitats, and I've changed that to requires grassland or shrubland habitats. And I think that's a really important distinction. And it's really why that their populations have declined as much as they have. So they forage primarily on seeds, leaves, insects. They eat a wide variety of material depending on the season. Acorns and crop seeds, residue left in crop fields, any type of green vegetation, and the summertime high protein insects are a big part of their diet as well. Something unique with quail is that they form these social groups that are called coveys. And these are groups of individuals that range from about 6 to 15 birds. And optimal covey size is around 12. And that's a good healthy covey size. If you get below 6, it's not good. You typically try to join up with another group of quail if they get down to that low of a level. An important aspect of quail ecology is that they're a short-lived species, but they've got a very high reproductive potential. And this is really important. It's important to realize that it affects both how quickly they can disappear from an area, because there's about a 70 to 80% mortality rate on quail annually. So, 7 or 8 of these birds won't live to be a year old. Or 7 or 8 out of 10 of these birds won't live to be a year old. So it's a situation where if things aren't right, if there's more birds dying than are being produced, you're going to see that population decline really quickly. On the other hand, they can really pump out the young when things are going well, and when habitat is good and weather is suitable, they can have 2 or sometimes 3 clutches of young a year, raise those broods, and that population can increase really quickly. So we'll dig a little bit into the history of bobwhite in Maryland, and I'll have a slide talking about some of our breeding bird survey data and some of the more quantitative measures of bobwhite abundance through time. But when you go beyond about 60 or 70 years ago, you need to look at some of the early reports, which are not quite as informative, but I still think we can glean some information from them and realize that quail were probably very abundant when European settlers came to Maryland. This is just an early account where they were talking about quail in almost endless numbers. And then for a period of, over several hundred years, there were good numbers of quail in the eastern part of the United States. This was a landscape where things probably were very good for quail. There were a lot of small fields and forest clearing taking place, and a lot of underbrush and weeds, and things were probably pretty good for quail, and their populations really thrived up through the late 1800s. There were reports of quail being in every field in the woods, and all the thickets, and by all accounts, they were very abundant. So quail were a very popular game bird for many years, and that continued up through the 1970s and 80s. We had many times more quail hunters than we did deer hunters at one point, which is hard to believe. At this point, we're down to just literally a handful of quail hunters, and nearly everybody that hunts now hunts deer, and deer are prolific. So we've had a big change in that dynamic, and it just is related to population of these birds. So moving on to the population status, this is a graph that I hate to look at too often as a quail biologist, but it's important to understand that this bird is really in trouble. They've declined at a rate of about 9.6% per year since 1966, based on the Breeding Bird Survey. So things are not looking well for quail. This is our breeding bird atlas data, and some of you birders may be involved with this effort, and you may be involved with the breeding bird survey as well. But this is really useful to get an idea of the range of these birds, and you can see here that in the most recent breeding bird atlas, which is a little dated at this point, it's being revised right now, so it will be interesting to see what we get from that most recent revision. But from this version, which is again is nearly 20 years old at this point, you can see where quail were predominantly found on the eastern shore, but we did have scattered pockets of quail throughout, particularly southern Maryland, and then a few in Washington County. One of the problems we run into with quail is that in trying to understand where there are still viable populations is that they're released often by either hunters for dog training or hunting purposes, but oftentimes it's by well-intentioned landowners that are trying to restore that population. They buy some birds from a supplier that breeds them and turns them loose, hoping to bring that bird back. And so we do have some birds that show up in parts of the state that we maybe wouldn't expect wild birds to be present, and it's hard to tease that apart in the data. And we'll talk a little bit more about pen-raised birds, I think, in a few minutes. So here's some more birder-produced data, which is awesome when we're trying to figure out where quail are and where to focus our efforts. Unfortunately, you can see that, so this is just like the sightings over the last 5 years. And you can see that, again, we're really clustered in the central, the eastern part of the state. The eastern shore is where our populations are the strongest. And even there, they've declined a lot. But, some areas, Dorchester County, there's some pockets in Talbot County, Kent County, where there's a lot of habitat work, and these birds are doing relatively well compared to other parts of the state. Southern region still has a few populations that we feel are hanging on there. Central part of the state not looking too good. We do get some scattered reports from here and there, but there hasn't been, as far as we can tell, there hasn't been a really healthy population of quail in central or western Maryland in probably at least 20 to 30 years. Maybe, again, a few scattered reports, some isolated populations, but nothing that's real consistent showing up in the data. Okay, so the $1 million question is, why did quail decline? And, I've heard it all. Like I said, I've been here about 20 years. I've talked to a lot of folks that really care deeply about quail. Everybody has their own ideas, and a lot of these, there might be some truth to it. It might be one component of the quail decline. But, quail are the most studied bird in North America. And there's a lot of biologists that have spent their entire careers trying to figure out what's going on with quail. And I think that everybody at this point is on board with the idea that habitat loss and fragmentation is the #1 factor causing the decline of quail nationwide. And then, these problems aren't occurring just in Maryland. This is a range-wide problem to some extent in every state. They're seeing declines. So I sort of developed this upside down triangle graphic here to show that I feel like habitat loss and fragmentation by far and away is the biggest problem that have impacted quail. And there's a couple components of that. One is what folks most often think about when they think of habitat loss. They think of development. Okay, we had some small farm fields here, and hedgerows and ditches that probably supported some quail 40 or 50 years ago, and that's been replaced by suburbia. And surely that affects quail, and that has really impacted quail in places like Central Maryland. So without a doubt, that has created some problems. But there's some other sort of less obvious types of habitat loss and fragmentation that have been just as damaging, if not more damaging than development, depending where you're at. One of those is just basically just cleaning things up. We've cleared out hedgerows, field edges. We mow right up to the edge. We crop right up to the edge of the field. There's no, so this is what we might call like a soft edge, where there's brush and some grasses and forbs and weeds, and this is excellent quail habitat. Most farms look like this. It's very clean fields and not a lot of vegetation. So we've generally just cleared things up. And an even less obvious habitat change that happens over many years, it doesn't occur quickly, is the maturing of woodlots and forests. And like I said, when historically in Maryland, when quail were thriving, there was these small woodlots, and there was a lot of pastures and crop fields that were like overgrown. They were coming back into forest, and they were basically just what we call early successional. I think I have a slide on that in a few slides. But it's a young type of habitat with a lot of brambles and thickets for places for quail to hide. And over time, those trees grow to a point where it shades out all of that understory, and all you're left with is leaf litter. And this is not quail habitat. They cannot survive here. They won't last very long at all before a predator finds them and has their way with them. So. So that's habitat loss and fragmentation. The second factor, sort of, broad category of factors that I feel have really impacted quail is changes in farming practices. And this is, a result of several things. Like I said, things have been cleaned up and we've taken a lot of cover out, but we've also changed the technology with the farming, the ways that we do farming. And there's less food and cover after harvest. So now a field is picked or harvested, and there's very little corn stubble or bean stubble. There's very little grain left out there to support these birds over the winter. There's increased use of herbicides and pesticides, which means fewer insects and weeds, both of which provide food for these birds throughout different times of the year. So in general, we've just sort of sterilized these agricultural areas that these birds once really thrived in, and have gone to a system where there isn't a lot of habitat, there's not a lot of food, and it just generally doesn't provide what the birds need to survive. And lastly, way down here at the very tip of my inverted triangle is increased predator populations. And, you know, for many years, we didn't really address this. We said, well, you know, they've coexisted with predators for many years, and it's not having an impact. You know, at this point, I think that most of us say, yes, you know, quail are impacted by predators, but, you know, they've coexisted for many years. And if you have proper habitat, the losses are offset by high reproduction. So we're going to assume that quite a few birds are going to be taken each year by predators. Has that number gone up over time? I think most of us would agree that yes, it has. You know, we simply have more raptors. We have more mammalian predators on the landscape. But if that habitat is correct, we will see those losses offset. And it's just showing a raptor going into a covey of quail back in the early 1800s. So obviously it was occurring even then. And like I said, you know, we realize that they've existed for many years with predators, and we're not advocating predator control in any way, but we do realize that, you know, species like Cooper's hawks, this is the breeding bird survey trend, and this species has just taken off in the last 20 years. It's literally an exponential rate of growth. I watched Cooper's hawks chase quail through hedgerows in places that you never would think that a hawk could go, running on the ground, diving in and out of briar patches, chasing quail until they caught a quail from a covey. They're really, really well suited predators of quail. And, you know, I feel like they definitely are having an impact. Again, if you have habitat, hopefully good nesting and brood rearing habitat, hopefully those birds can make up the difference from their overwinter losses from hawks. And then you have other things, you know, feral cats and mammalian predators, which are taking their share as well. Just wanted to make a point that quail populations are decreasing throughout their range, and this is anything in red here is decreasing at a pretty swift rate. There are a few pockets in western portion of their range where we have really large expanses of grassland that they're holding their own, possibly even increasing slightly. But in the east, everybody's in the same boat as Maryland. So one of the questions I get is, first question is, what happened to the quail? And the second question is, well, can't we just get some more quail and release them? And the answer is yes, you can get more quail and release them, because these are a bird that does pretty well in captivity. There's breeders of quail. Folks keep them as a hobby. They keep them for quail eggs. They keep them to eat, whatever. But there's definitely places you can get quail. The question is, what will they do after you release them? And this is kind of a dated project at this point, but but the data hasn't changed. You know, I've dealt with a lot of landowners over the years, and what they did here in Virginia about 20 years ago is they relocated some wild quail. So they took wild quail, moved them from one location to another, and then tracked how many survived. This is the number of days after release here, 10, 20, 30, 40. And you can see the wild birds suffered high losses, but about 20% ended up surviving a few months later. But the real point of me putting this up here was, look at the red. These are the pen-raised quail. These are the birds that you can just buy from a breeder and turn them loose. They released several hundred birds, and every one of those quail was dead within 9 days after being released. I'm not saying that a few won't survive longer. You know, if you release them in maybe different ways, and landowners have tried all the ways to make them more wild, more wary of predators, and basically to get them to survive longer. But in the end, if you're trying to restore a wild quail population, pen-raised quail is just simply going down the wrong path, and it isn't really going to accomplish the goal. So it brings us back to the first and largest issue, which is that habitat loss and fragmentation. You know, we need habitat to bring these birds back. So if we want to put quail habitat on the landscape, we need to know what it is. And here's a bunch of technical language. Early successional grassland, shrubland, or woodland habitat with a diversity of grasses, forbs, shrubs, or small trees and food sources. And like I said, those food sources can be a variety of things. I think it's easier to kind of visualize, and I think I have some photos in here, but I'm gonna first mention this term early successional habitat, something that you may or may not have heard in the past. Basically, we're talking about the vegetation that will come in. You know, just visualize that you just let a crop, you know, you harvest a cornfield and you just walk away. You know, what's going to happen? Well, it's not just going to stay in corn stubble and dirt forever. You know, things are going to happen. And in the first year, you're going to have these annual weeds. And we say weeds are a good thing when it comes to quail. They like weeds, but you know, things like ragweed and foxtail, plants like that are oftentimes really that's preferred food sources and preferred cover for quail. Now it's going to come in the first year. Second year, you'll have a few more grasses starting to grow there, and then years 3 to 5, you're going to get some shrubs coming in. Depending on the site, you know, this can move along a little quicker, or it could move along a little more slowly, depending if it's a fertile site or not. But the point is that this type of habitat is what we call early successional, and it's where quail live. But it's fleeting. After 6 to 10 years or so, it's grown up to the point where you have these trees growing. And you're starting to lose the value of that habitat. These trees will start to shade out all of the beneficial weeds, grasses, and shrubs that quail and a lot of other species need, and it will start to revert to a forest. Just going to go through a series of photos just to kind of give you a visual, representative sample of places where there are quail, or where at least there were quail when I took these photos. And you'll see some similarities. You know, you're going to see the quote weeds, the grasses, the diversity. You know, take note of the diversity. It's not just one thing. You know, you've got a crop field, and then you've got goldenrod and maybe beggar's ticks and blackberry and a variety of grasses. You definitely start to see some similarities in these places that hold quail. You also start to realize that there's not many of these places left. You know, they just don't exist like they used to be on the landscape. So again, you know, you've got some similarities here, the diversity. This is kind of a unique one here, and this is something that we're shouldn't say we're just starting to do. It's been a decade or so that we've been managing forest land with quail specifically in mind, and we're just generating that same type of habitat under a canopy of widely spaced trees, but the sunlight on the ground is still important. And so, you know, we've kind of looked at what quail habitat is, and I want to make sure that people realize that you know, this type of habitat is helping a lot of other species. Um, you know, here's some examples, and I'm doing quail surveys in the summer, and I'm hearing a ton of yellow-breasted chats and field sparrows and prairie warblers. Not so many dick thistles, but it is still, you know, some overlap in that habitat. A lot of other species as well. You know, blue grosbeaks and you know, the list goes on. There's grasshopper sparrows are another one that do really well in quail habitat. So a lot of birds that are declining that are you know, of interest really do well in the same type of habitat. Pollinators are big news lately, and those species benefit from same types of habitat management, and some of the game species as well. You know, turkey, folks that really like seeing turkeys, and turkeys are doing quite well. But we have the most turkeys, we often have some pretty good quail habitat as well. These turkey poults are about the same size as a quail. They eat the same stuff. They're trying to stay safe from the same predators. So it makes sense. You know, if you've got good quail habitat, you're going to have a healthy turkey population. And just to kind of drive that point home, you know, some of you might have seen this, but it was a few years ago. North American Bird Conservation Initiative came out with this publication. It got some press in some of the national news outlets. And it was talking about, you know, birds are in trouble. We've lost a lot of birds over the last, you know, several decades. And the suite of birds that has declined the most is a suite of grassland birds, 53% decrease since 1970. And here, quail are featured in these materials, where nationwide they've declined about 78%. And like I said, that's even worse in Maryland. So let's look at Maryland, and this is straight from our breeding birds survey, 1966 through 2019, which is the most recent data that I had on hand. And these are the most declining bird species in Maryland, and it really sticks out as to what types of habitats we're losing the quickest. Bobwhite, pheasant, vesper sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, you know, prairie warbler, yellow-breasted chat, all are this grassland or what's termed successional, you know, young forest type of birds. So again, it's, you know, forests are increasing, these types of habitats are decreasing. You know, everything is important, but you know, if we don't do something to reverse this trend, we're going to lose some of these species in the near future. Okay, so quail nesting, they're pretty interesting birds. They nest May through August, and they have this really interesting mating system. We call it a promiscuous mating system, where one male will mate with many females, and vice versa. And what's pretty interesting is that both parents may incubate or raise the young. So in really good habitat, those females will kind of lay their nest, lay their eggs, and then go off and initiate another nest, and that male is left to incubate and raise those young. It's a good way to really produce a lot of young if conditions are good. Unfortunately, low nest success is very common, and usually over half of those nests are predated by something. You know, foxes, cats, black rat snakes, possums, raccoons. The list goes on and on. A lot of things like eating quail and quail eggs. This is typical nesting habitat. They nest in these grasses that we talked about, these native bunch grasses, and they just tuck their nest up under there and hope that nothing finds them for several weeks. Brood rearing period is another very vulnerable time. These chicks are about the size of a bumblebee when they're hatched out. So they're tasty, little morsels for a lot of predators. They're going to leave the nest soon after hatching. So these are not like songbirds at all. You know, they're not being fed by their young. They leave that nest and they have to move around and forage on their own and look for insects and try to learn from the hen about staying alive and finding food. Very high mortality during this time period of over 75% usually. This is good brood habitat here. This is partridge pea. Ragweed serves the same purpose, but you need insects and you need to be able to move around underneath a canopy of vegetation. That's the two critical components to that. And just want to make a comment on that. You know, this is one thing that really sticks out as being a limiting factor on a lot of properties. You'll have what looks like good habitat, but when you get out there, you realize that it is way too thick at ground level for a small bird like a quail to actually navigate through that vegetation. This is a good example of enough bare ground in there where they can actually move around and forage. Most places have fescue or sod forming grasses that limit the movement and choke out good plants. So another very important type of habitat, especially in the northern part of their range, like where we're at, is the shrubby vegetation. This what we call escape or winter cover, patches of briars or brambles, small trees. It needs to be dense enough to provide protection from predators. And we need to have quite a few of these spread out over the landscape. Usually we want them spaced out no more than a softball throw apart. That's just simply because a quail doesn't typically fly very far. So we want to have these close enough that a quail, when pursued by a predator, can dive into one of these patches of escape cover. Usually quail don't hang too far from these places, and that's why they're kind of called these cubby headquarters, is a term that you'll hear thrown around quite a bit from quail biologists or land managers. This shows why this escape or winter cover is so important. We had in the winter of 2009 and 10, we did a research project up in Kent County, had a really thriving quail population. So we put radio transmitters on a bunch of birds. I think it was 78 birds, if I remember correctly. And 77 of those birds died within 3 months because this winter, and I don't know if you recall, but we had 3 feet of snow on the ground for a couple weeks. It was very, very hard on the quail population. And we sort of documented that decline. They were getting predated by mainly avian predators, but also some mammalian predators throughout that time period. And snow can be pretty deadly on quail populations. So hopefully they're not suffering too bad at this point with the snow that we've had in the last couple of weeks. And then just the fact that these are resident birds, they don't move around a whole lot. You need to have all this type of cover in a fairly small area, or it's not going to work. You can't have your nesting cover, 2 miles away from your escape cover and expect to have a thriving quail population. Okay, so something important when it comes to managing this habitat is to remember, it's called early successional habitat, but it's not going to remain early successional for very long. I mentioned before, it's going to grow up and it wants to succeed into a forest. You need to do something to manage it. And this is a lot of times where, we do a restoration project. It looks good for a few years, but over time, it needs something done to it. It needs to either be disced or burned, and prescribed burning is actually one of the better ways to manage this type of habitat. Or you can come in periodically and conduct a timber harvest, which, a lot of folks think that this is destroying habitat. It is destroying habitat for some forest birds, but you're creating habitat for a lot of these other birds that are declining. So, there's winners and losers, so to speak. Just want to mention a little bit more about prescribed burning because it is a tool that we're using more and more. Herbert Stoddard, one of the foremost quail researchers back in the day, he referred to quail as the firebird because they were really linked to fire landscapes that were managed by fire for centuries, starting back with Native Americans and the history of early settlers using fire on the landscape. Fire sets back that plant succession like I was talking about, and it reduces that vegetation density, and it does a good job of promoting valuable native vegetation. Brings up a interesting little side tangent that I thought I'd throw in here. You know, and it's a question that I've thought about a lot. Well, before we had agriculture, before settlement, where would have bobwhites have lived? You know, because we think of them as a bird of like the agricultural landscape, you know, field edges and hedgerows and things like that. Well, there's strong evidence that there was frequent fire throughout much of the United States. And you probably can't see this, the numbers down here, but if it's orange and all of Maryland is orange except for Garrett County, it was burned. This is based on fire scars that and some modeling work done by this researcher in 2012. But if it's orange, it was burned at least once every 10 years. So historically, all of Maryland, except like I said, for Garrett County, was burned on a fairly frequent basis. On the Lower Eastern Shore, burned every 2 to 4 years. So it was an important part of the vegetation, you know, important. It definitely shaped the vegetation and the ecology of the area. I'm sure quail benefited. So if you had frequent fire, this is probably what you ended up with. This is probably what a lot of Maryland looked like. You know, it wasn't dense forest. It was this forest, but it was open forest with really good diverse habitat, lush herbaceous layer. And it probably would have benefited a lot of critters that we had at that point. You know, we had bison, we had elk, large grazing animals that also would have affected the landscape with their grazing. And probably quail really benefited, and they did very well. But that was, you know, an interesting little tangent, but we probably aren't going to get back to a Maryland where we have widespread fires and bison and elk on the landscape. So what are we doing now about the declines, and what can we do? For starters, we're a part of the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. They've done a range-wide plan and provides guidance and support to states. They do a lot of national, you know, policy issue type of work. They help to make these farm bill programs, which I'll talk about in a minute, better for quail, and try to, you know, keep the momentum up to restore quail in these states. At the state level, we're doing a lot of work on our public lands, and particularly where we still have quail, which, you know, we're trying to sort of halt the declines where we can, so stop the bleeding, so to speak. And we do a wide variety of habitat improvements, and put this graphic up, really throwing the kitchen sink at some of these areas and trying to bring quail back on these properties. This is just one example of what we're doing. Like I said, we're doing a lot of things, but we're trying to take some of these forests that are really not very productive for wildlife, not a lot of food value here. These are previous pine plantation forests, and we thin them, we open them up, and we start that prescribed fire rotation, and we end up with a really cool habitat that's, it turns out that this is doing really well for, you know, not only quail, but a lot of songbirds, a lot of rare plants, very rare plants, actually, like state threatened, state endangered plants are present in these areas. But we also work on private lands, and there are a lot of programs. I'm not going to get into all the details on this, but you know, you can get my contact information. I think I have it here on the last slide. Jot down my information. If you own private lands, especially on the Eastern Shore, but but or if you know anybody, but we're not going to ignore anybody that has an interest in putting this type of habitat out there. There are a lot of incentive programs available, CRP, CREP. Again, you could spend an hour talking about these, but we can put in some good habitat with either us or some of our partners that we work with. Even if you don't have land, you can do some things to help. You can spread the word about the decline of quail and these other grassland and shrubland birds. A lot of people don't realize the importance of habitat management and how important that is for certain suites of bird species. You can't just sort of walk away and preserve areas and expect to have a species like quail or chats or field sparrows. You can't expect them to do well. They need some sort of disturbance or management to persist, and it's up to us to do that. So we encourage landowners to establish and maintain that type of habitat. Every little bit helps. And just a quick note that there is hope. This habitat management works. The red line here is one of our wildlife management areas. We didn't have quail there for a period of about 5 or 6 years. They were zero. They were extirpated in that area. We started managing the habitat. They found it. It's kind of a, if you build it, they will come kind of scenario. And now that population is doing pretty well. And we see and hear birds down there a lot. We're maintaining quail populations in other areas. There's also some private landowners that are doing a phenomenal job, and they're seeing more quail than they've ever seen on their properties in 40, 50 years of them owning it. So some exciting things going on. Unfortunately, they're still declining in a lot of places, but we're trying to do what we can to bring them back. Now, I think we're running short on time, so I won't go over that. I think I'll just go ahead and take any questions that might have come up and see if I can. I guess I have to stop sharing to be able to see the questions. Or no, I can click on it here at the top. So we'll go through a few of these questions in the 10 minutes or so that we have. Miranda says it looks like your photos that overbrowsing by large deer populations may have played a role in changing the composition of Maryland forest. Do you consider deer a largish factor in quail declines? I would say that I wouldn't say a largish. I would say it's a smallish factor, but yeah. So deer in certain places, I've seen them have a large impact on the habitat that we're trying to manage for, and they do a lot of damage on some really beneficial plants for sure. But as far as them really being a driving factor, I would say that there's some other much bigger problems that I would put first. But definitely something to consider, and we always recommend controlling deer population if you're looking to manage for wildlife species. Are there any other quail species in Maryland? If so, how are they faring? No, bobwhite quail are the only quail species we have, and I wish there was something else that could fill that niche and do better, but no, they're the only ones that we've ever had in Maryland. We do have some other gallinaceous birds. We've got ruffed grouse out in the western part of the state, which are a ground nesting bird, similar but a little bit bigger, and they're not doing well either. So yeah, so ground in general, ground nesting birds that don't roost in trees, not doing so well. Let's see, is multiflora rose and stiltgrass, bittersweet honeysuckle is more of a problem than food source? I guess that means, are they more of a problem than the birds not having uh, enough food? Um, I would say some of those species can be problematic if over, if it's taken over an area. But again, diversity is the key, and as long as they're kept under control, um, sometimes I don't necessarily think that the quail really care if there's if the shrub is a multiflora or a blackberry bush, as long as that rose is not so widespread and overtaking an area so much that there's not anything else in that area. So we always like to control those invasives, but as long as they're kept under control, we don't feel that it's necessarily a huge problem with quail. Amy says, could you speak to reverse fragmentation? How large does a patch of habitat need to be? Oh, great question, Amy. And I didn't get into that. I have a couple of slides for some of my longer presentations, but the patches of habitat for quail need to be pretty large, and there's some debate, but we're probably talking a couple hundred acres. So it doesn't have to be all on the same property, but it doesn't have to be one block, but it should be connected habitat where these birds from here can get over to another patch of habitat and vice versa, and to be able to move around. It's an important thing, and we can, even when we have small patches of good habitat, a lot of times we see birds blink out in those locations because it's not connected to something else. So it's a big issue. Status of quail in Maryland. They're not threatened or endangered. They're still, but they are on our species of greatest concern list, which is where a lot of our wildlife species are that we're definitely concerned about, but they're not to the point where we consider them in imminent danger of extinction in Maryland. Steve says that his father trained his own setters. Let's see. Yeah, so plenty of quail back then. No-till, he's asking, has no-till farming been a major contributor? I would say that no-till farming is good for a lot of things. It probably again is a factor, and some of the things that they do as part of that farming system is probably not real beneficial to quail, and probably detrimental. But I would not call it a major contributor. Probably one factor as part of that more overarching, increasing farming efficiency sort of umbrella that I mentioned earlier. Again, how many contiguous acres of ideal vegetation are required to sustain a population? It sounds like 3 to 5 coveys would need to combine over winter to make a reasonable covey. And that's exactly right. These coveys will get whittled down, and they need to be able to find other coveys to join with during those critical late winter periods. They can't do that, and then you'll see those populations blink out. So it's exactly right. And again, you're going to need a couple hundred acres probably to do that, in reality. So yeah, very good question. Is there any good habitat for bobwhite at the Audubon sanctuaries? I know that in the Talbot County Pickering Creek Sanctuary has a couple quail still kicking around there, I believe, last I heard, maybe a year or two ago. I'm not sure about the central part of the state. I don't spend as much time over there. So I'd love to hear from someone if you've heard of any birds over in that part of the state. Dennis asks about the increase in Cooper's hawk populations. Will they eventually dramatically reduce populations of both passerines and gallinaceous birds? You know, that's a tough one. That's maybe more than I can get into at this point. But I think they're definitely having an impact. I don't think that any predator will be the ultimate reason that a bird, you know, goes extinct or you know gets in that trouble. You know, there's a as populations get lower, they're going to switch over to a different prey, but they will take a lot of quail and have an impact on that population. It's our job to give them the habitat to protect them from those predators. Okay, contact info. Oh, Deborah asked about contact info, and there it is. Hopefully you can see that down there at the bottom of the screen. Do people used to feed them during harsh winters to help quail survive? That's a good question. They actually did. I have some reports from, oh, it was in the 30s or 40s, and they were actually feeding quail in like the suburbs of Baltimore. They actually had police. They had the law enforcement folks out there feeding quail during harsh winters. Pretty interesting. I don't think it was widespread though. I think that they had what they needed to survive. I don't think that farmers necessarily understood what they needed at that point. It was just a function of the landscape, and it was just that the habitat was more conducive to having quail that in the past. Okay, Lauren asks, are any incentives being considered for farmers to maintain hedgerows and habitat at field edges? Yes, so that was that one slide that I mentioned, CRP, CREP, EQIP. There's there's a lot of acronyms. They stand for different programs that are out there that will pay landowners cash to take land out of production, to do things along the edges of their crop fields. The tools are there. The tools are in the toolbox. We just need these landowners to actually, do it and sign up for these programs. There's a lot of hesitancy with taking any. I'm not going to say it's just farmers, but just people in general. They don't really necessarily, want the government to come in to help. The old saying, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. We really are, but these landowners a lot of times are hesitant to sign up for things. But yeah, those programs definitely are there. Some of them pay better than others. If there's some sort of water quality benefit, oftentimes those are have higher incentives, payments for those programs. So there's a lot of complexities with that. But if somebody comes out there and takes a look at your habitat, we can get you signed up for something. Dennis asked, how do you get quail established at Nanticoke wildlife management areas like Nanticoke where populations drop to zero? Like I said, we did the if you build it, they will come strategy there. There was quail in that general vicinity, a mile down the road, maybe, we'd see a bird here or there. And so they were in that landscape. When we did the habitat work, we basically took out about 100 acres, 150 acres of crop land there and planted native grasses and started to burn that and try to reproduce those grassland conditions that quail need. And took 2 or 3 years, 4 years of doing that. And those birds found it, came in there, brought, presumably brought off a few nests of young, and then, it started that process. And then that's what you need. It's much more difficult if you're not near an existing population. And, I won't get into all the details of that, but there are some options there as well. And so David says, unfortunately, at the Central Maryland sanctuaries, no quail exist there. So thanks for that. Be interesting to know how long ago it was that you had quail there. from everything I've heard, the winter of 1978 really was tough on central Maryland and western Maryland's quail population. That there was plenty of birds, and that winter really was hard on them. And so it's unfortunate that they couldn't rebound from that, but they were already declining probably from these habitat losses prior to that. So, and thanks, Steve. Steve's a landowner that we've worked with in the past. He's talks about some of the work that he's done. So great. Hope things are going well with you, Steve. So guess I can stop sharing.
Great.
We appreciate everybody's questions and participation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was really fascinating and if not very sobering information. So thank you for taking the time to walk us through that. And thank you also to all our participants for your really great questions. If you do think of any other follow-up questions, we will include Bob's contact information in the email that we send out with the link to the recording. Feel free to share that recording with anyone else who couldn't make it or you think might be interested. And stay tuned for future webinars in our series. And thank you again to everyone and good night.